Hello everybody. My name is Afaf Mahfouz and I'm past president of the Conference of NGOs in consultative relationship with the United Nations, which is called Congo around the United Nations system. The Conference of NGOs is as old as the United Nations, or almost. We are going to talk today about the role of the United Nations and civil society. This paper is meant to be a discussion paper to stimulate ideas and thinking about our world from the vantage point of one, who's me, who has worked for many years with non-governmental organizations or NGOs, locally, nationally, and internationally, and in recent years, often on the fringes of the United Nations. It's no way comprehensive, but rather selective presentation touching upon a large and complex topic. The paper has the perspective of one educated and living in the North, France and the United States, and formed with lifelong relationships in Egypt and an identity in the developing world. It also had the perspective of a professor who worked with students from the four corners of the earth as an NGO activist in the North as well as in the South. Finally, it has the perspective of a psychoanalyst who deals with prejudice and individual trauma and who knows that before we are members of any group or while we are members of a group, we are first individuals with unique perspectives, hopes, losses, fears, and fantasies. We are interrelated and interdependent on a global scale without precedent. Building a new world order will have to embrace our global diversity, a diversity that becomes more and more apparent as the borders of states become porous and the world seems to shrink. We become exposed to new influences, challenges, and change. We shall talk about the United Nations, but keep in mind the states, international and regional organizations, multinational corporations that affect us as individuals in our own communities. I want to discuss here the way we individuals may be expressing our voices through new forms of communication and participation in what is increasingly referred to as civil society, largely made of NGOs or non-governmental organizations, to which I shall refer principally. With their seemingly infinite numbers and extraordinary diversity, NGOs work in a confusing and apparently disorganized way in the space between individuals, government, international, regional organization, and the private sector. They provide services and often advocate, critique, and assist to bring about change. Motivated most of the time neither by profit or political power, NGOs have become special actors on the world stage today. One reason why Kyung-Hee University hosted the Seoul International Conference of NGOs here in Seoul in the year 1999. It did so and in cooperation with the ultimate exemplar of hope for a new world order, the United Nations. Our first point then is the United Nations, and we start with the point A, the beginnings. The Charter of the United Nations begin with the phrase, "We, the people of the United Nations." As the representatives of the people of the world, the founders, all governments, started out by expressing their hopes for a world free from war, characterized by justice, human rights, social progress, better standards of life in larger freedoms, tolerance, and peace. They were determined that armed force would not be used, save in the common interest and would employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. Its proponents hoped that they were on the verge of constructing a new world order in the aftermath of two horrific world wars and the failed League of Nations. Despite such high rhetoric, the Charter created an organization that mirrored its time, largely serving the interests of the five victorious powers in World War II: the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. Each was given a veto over all decisions of the Security Council, the only UN body that could enforce its own resolutions. Its initial 51 members were mostly from the northern countries, much of the rest of the world referred to over the years as the less developed countries, the Third World, or the Global South, was under colonial rule. For years, the UN was a focus of great power rivalry and manipulation. A seat at the United Nations was coveted proof of a new state's existence and legitimacy in the family of nations. Although the Security Council was effectively controlled by the veto members, the United Nations General Assembly with all member states was open to wide participations. However, now a body with 191 members and no enforcement authority, the great powers can largely ignore it and other UN organs on important matters, even though debates in the General Assembly may have an effect on international public opinion. Some states that followed the lead of Yugoslavia, India, Indonesia, and Egypt in the 60s to form a group of non-aligned countries in the Cold War today participate in the group of 77 that seeks to strengthen the General Assembly. The second point here I wanted to talk about is peacemaking. No organization has worked more tirelessly than the UN to preserve and bring about peace. While its failure have gained headlines, there has been a dramatic decline in armed conflict. Most UN efforts at preventive diplomacy to prevent wars, peacemaking missions to end conflicts, peacekeeping operations to stop conflicts from restarting, and international sanction have been quite successful. These efforts have cost a tiny fraction of what wars would have cost and have prevented the devastation that would have mainly affected helpless women and children. My third point under the United Nations is the World Conferences and the Millennium Development Goal. The United Nations has always been the preeminent forum for discussion of global concerns. The form of organization of such discussions evolved over the years and ultimately led to a series of United Nations World Conferences, beginning with the UN Conferences on Environment and Development in 1990. These conferences will be counted as among the greatest accomplishments of the United Nations. I say this for many reasons. First, they focus thinking on major areas of human concern in a systematic manner, one by one. Second, they reach out beyond government officials to expert specialists worldwide and in part through the NGO forums frequently associated with them. They achieved dialogue with the NGOs and broader elements of civil society. Third, they reached conclusion and prepared plans of action that were disseminated over the years to governments and to citizens at large, where they were studied, critiqued, and further disseminated. Many have become a benchmark of where the world should be. The list is familiar. We have the UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna 1993, the International Conference on Population Development in Cairo 1994, the World Summit for Social Development, Stockholm 1995, the Fourth World Conference on Women, Beijing 1995, the Second UN Conference on Human Settlements in Istanbul 1996, the World Food Summit in Rome 1996, the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia and Related Intolerance in Durban, year 2001, the World Conference on Financing for Development, Monterrey, year 2002. The impact of these conferences is impossible to underestimate. One, many of the themes of the conference intersected, and so they were discussed more than once, gaining renewed emphasis when viewed from a new perspective. The consensus on the environment and the new consensus on women's empowerment are just two of many areas of discussion that have had revolutionary impact in many countries. Women coming together at the NGO Forum in Beijing in 1995 learned that they were not alone in their concerns. Women in neighboring countries usually had similar concerns, and these in turn were often shared by women in sub-region or an entire region. They went home to their countries transformed by the experience. I was one of them. Many felt empowered, able to cite the support of their sisters and the internationally agreed upon text in the Beijing Declaration and Program of Action. The impact percolated to cities, towns, and villages throughout the world. It was fantastic. 2, each conference had a 5-year follow-up conference or General Assembly meeting to assess the progress made by each country in meeting the goals set by the international community. Even governments that previously may not have treated women's concerns seriously were held accountable domestically to civil society in their own countries and internationally in the halls of the General Assembly. The cycle was repeated on the environment, in population, human rights, children, and the subject areas of other conferences. By the end of the 10-year cycle, the world community appeared to have reached a consensus on a set of goals at the United Nations when it hosted a Millennium NGO Forum. A month later, at the Millennium General Assembly, heads of state adopted a Millennium Declaration with goals for the world in the 21st century. Over the next 5 years, the Secretariat and Secretary General painstakingly negotiated with member states a series of specific goals with benchmarks and targets to be achieved by the world community. These objectives were said to have been embraced by heads of states attending the September year 2005 General Assembly meetings. D, it's a point which I entitle United Nations Under Siege. Yet, the United Nations is far from having achieved the influence its advocates may have wished, in part because it has a restricted capacity to the change. 3 critical areas. First, a Security Council controlled by powers that won a war 60 years ago. Second, an unwieldy General Assembly in which the smallest of states have votes equal to the largest. Third, a Secretary General who lacks the executive authority to make decisions and manage the organization and who is pressured from all sides for favor and influence. Furthermore, the UN is dominated more than ever by a single superpower, skeptical of multilateralism, and that's often unwilling to pay fully for either its basic budget or peace-related commitment that have been voted for. The indignity of a new US ambassador tabling at the very last minute some 400 reservations to a text of the Millennium Development Goals just prior to September 2005 General Assembly reflects these constraints, although ultimately most of the goals survived. Although much of the world bridles at American arrogance, the ground is fertile for detractors to challenge the United Nations. Political cronyism and sexism among staff, a rigid personal system resistant to anything that will make staff accountable for the work they do, corruption at headquarters and the field have all been well documented. The year 2004 terrorist attack on the UN mission in Iraq raised questions of whether the UN could protect its own staff and whether the UN should have undertaken a mission resulting from an invasion it had not approved. Terrorists could see the UN as simply another part of the foreign invasion. Additional harm to its credibility has occurred in mismanagement of the Iraq oil for food program and rapes of civilians by UN peacekeepers in Africa. Calls for reform of the United Nations come from many quarters in the hope that the organization, created in the post-war World War II era, can respond to the needs of a vastly different globalized world in another century. Here I go to my second point, which is on other elements of our world order. And I start with the states. It's very important because the United Nations is an intergovernmental organization. Now, for the past century, the world order has belonged to nation states, the dominant political entities of our era. Citizens look to states to guarantee basic rights, including nationality, national security, access to basic education, justice, equality before the law, non-discrimination, and the right to work. They look to states to provide the legal, financial, and regulatory infrastructure that facilitates commerce, employment, transport, communications, and protection of the environment. In democratic states, citizens also expect to have a voice in government. For states in 1945, history appeared to have taught a lesson that the principal cause of war was the violation of the borders of states. A United Nations firmly committed to respect for borders might prevent recurrence of war. Not so curiously, in 1963, independent states of Africa, knowing that their borders were arbitrary creations drawn up in Europe, made sanctity of borders the bedrock of the Organization of African Unity. Would secure borders help states live together? If they thought so, their leaders didn't foresee a post-Cold War, globalized world where threats to security are as likely to come from within as from without. Witness Serbia, Chechnya, Rwanda, Sudan, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire. Did they foresee the threat of terrorism can be either international or homegrown? Threats don't have to be violent. They come in many forms. The United States has been unable to stem the domination of Chinese products in local stores and the bleeding of the American manufacturing sector, or of illegal Mexican workers taking jobs Americans don't want. Foreigners own more of their national debt than Americans do. What will happen if they put their savings and investment elsewhere or stop buying dollars? How can the United States remain the only superpower when it consistently imports so much more than it exports? Technically, it should be subject to IMF rules of structural adjustment. Other countries have similar problems. Can European countries serve their older population and remain competitive in a global economy without immigrant workers? How do they adapt to immigrant workers who stay at the fringes of society ready to explode, as they have for the past 2 weeks in France? Can Japan survive without welcoming immigration? What does national identity mean when workers can migrate anywhere for jobs, or when the internet enables workers in India to replace workers in other countries without leaving home? Jamaicans complain that structural adjustment forced open their borders to unfair competition from outside and destroy their economy. Korea and Thailand were victims of currency speculation, where the IMF bailed out the creditors and unnecessarily inflicted punishment on local people and enterprises that lasted for years. The French complain about the dominance of American culture. The fact is that problems and solutions both cross borders: disease, migration, trade, investment, cultural ideas, and now the outsourcing of jobs with the internet. A quintessential example may have been described by Tom Friedman in his current best-selling book, The World is Flat. He described a McDonald's restaurant in Montana, in the United States, that takes orders via internet, phone, from drivers who approach the restaurant's takeout window. The order goes from the microphone via internet to India from the United States. There, an employee with an American accent takes it down and sends it into the kitchen back in Montana, along with a photo of the driver. Can you believe that? The owner said this system works faster than having a person at the drive-in window, saves money, and reduces the number of orders given to the wrong driver. The example should cause governments, civil society, and individuals to either think about taking advantage of this global invasion, as businesses are already doing, or, if not, at least to think about how come to terms with a world where borders mean so little. Yes, states are responsible for what goes on inside the borders they have tried so hard to reinforce, but they are increasingly unable to control what gets across as borders become more and more porous. And as this happens, who can address the influence that come from outside? My point B is about international and regional organizations. Although global issues now pose challenges for every state, global challenges have brought to states the need for global governance without global government. This requires acceptance of multilateralism, an institution through which multilateral action may take place. This multilateralism has been embodied in the United Nations, as we have seen, and also in a range of other international organizations developed since 1945 around the United Nations. The UN has tried to address matters of peace, security, and provided the world's most open, democratic, and respected global forum for discussion. United Nations programs, funds, and largely autonomous specialized agencies have worked in many areas. Example, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the World Food Programme, the International Labour Organization, the United Nations Fund for Women, the United Nations Development Programme, which has pioneered in looking at development holistically from a human perspective through its annual human development reports. Also, more technical organizations such as the Universal Postal Union, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the World Meteorological Organization quietly improve the functioning of the world in which we live. These organizations and many more have fulfilled hopes and made the world a better place. I wanted to talk about the IMF, the World Bank, and WTO, but I think I will just, for the sake of time, I will go right away to another concept of international organization, which is the regional unions. Because in addition to this international organization that have global reach, regional organizations are playing an increasingly important role. Preeminent among them is the European Union. The EU has ever so slowly evolved out of states over more than 50 years. It's now a regional entity that is taking on many of the structures and responsibilities of its member states, and someday it may ultimately supersede them. Long in development and still in process, the EU could serve as a precedent for similar groupings in other regions. The African Union, the Arab League, the Organization of American States are too large and diverse either to become regional equivalents of the EU. However, sub-regional entities such as the Southern African Development Community and the Economic Community of West African States have initiated forms of economic cooperation and cross-border movement of people and goods not dissimilar to those of activities in the early years of the European communities. Point C is the multinational corporations. Transnational corporations are private business on a global scale. And in a globalized free market, local enterprises, public or private, are hard-pressed to compete with firms that have such weapons at their disposal, and the best local resources often fall into foreign ownership. Paradoxically, China, with the attraction of the largest potential market in the world, has been able to lure foreign firms to operate on its own terms in such a way that effectively steals their intellectual and establishes competitor, a practice that may not long survive legal challenges. In India and some other Asian countries, genuine partnerships have been developed with leading transnational in outsourcing of manufacturing and services to apparent mutual benefit. This trend poses threats to workers, manufacturing and services elsewhere, particularly in the United States. Now we come to the last point in this whole thing, individuals. It's us, you and me, or you and I. Now, doesn't all really come back to individuals? Let us ask, what is the purpose of human life? As we here in fulfillment, are we here in fulfillments of God's design? Are we here because of the love of our parents? Are we here for family? Are we here simply because we happen to be created? Note that the state never figures in our response to these questions. Then, once here, what is the purpose of our life? To serve family? To serve God? To serve our community? To serve humankind? Are we here to consume as much as we can? To be as powerful as we can? To gain power over others? To love others? Are there many purposes? Whatever we are the building blocks of the world. We are the reason human organization exists. And whether it's under God, family, community, or state, as human beings anywhere on earth, we have certain rights that have been codified through the United Nations in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first of 30 articles states, I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood," unquote. I would add, and sisterhood. Individuals may be buffeted by natural forces beyond their control, catastrophes like tsunami, hurricanes, earthquakes, and famines, disease like HIV, AIDS, malaria, bird flu, and cancer. They may have to suffer political systems that are corrupt and dominated by money and nepotism. Economic systems where poverty is widespread and the only rule is the survival of either the fittest or the offspring of the privileged, and social system where racism is rampant and prejudice is the norm. Available education may be abysmal, access may be unequal, and girls may be excluded. Death of parent, child, or other loved one by natural causes, criminal acts, or war may cause wounds that remain through our lives. Fortunately, few people experience many of the above, and their positive experience serve as a counterbalance. A mother's love, a child's laughter, warmth of friendship and intimacy, wonder of nature, beauty of music, thrill of accomplishment, pride in being recognized, satisfaction at making a difference, a decent school, a decent job. In a rich country or in a poor one, these kinds of experiences, taken together, shape our individual identity and outlook. Technology has added another dimension to individual existence by providing entertainment and tools for productivity and communication that can free us from many of the constraints of our environment and empower us to do more than be more connected to information, people, and institutions that we could ever have imagined. However, resources are finite, and many of these positive experiences may hardly apply to those who are living in poverty. For one of the greatest characteristics of our current era, despite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is the enduring and growing inequality we find in the world among rich and poor countries, and among rich and poor, even the world's greatest superpower. In both cases, the gap for individuals is widening and poverty becomes more obscene. Here is where we need to move from individuals back to human organization to begin to address the challenges that face us today. That's why we are coming to the civil society, which is our third point, and NGOs. Between the state and the private sector, there exists a large sphere of public activities called civil society. Some of this space is occupied by academic institutions, professional groups, business associations, trade unions, cooperatives, and community organizations. The largest space, particularly in democratic societies, however, is occupied by non-governmental organizations or NGOs. Although reliable statistics are not available, some of us estimate NGOs in the world hundreds of thousands, and some estimated, like Ambassador Reid this morning at the university here, 10,000, 10 of thousands. With such numbers, almost any generalization about them could probably be proven not applicable in some cases. However, at base, they are incorporated as not-for-profit entities. NGOs are not supposed to be established to serve any private interest. They operate in three broad areas of activity: public policy advocacy, service delivery, and membership services. Then first, advocacy. Advocacy, NGOs working in advocacy might, for example, have a particular interest in the environment, a topic of keen concern here in Korea. They would try to bring the attention of government or business or international organization to a proposed project, such as a dam, to assess the potential environment impact the project would have on the society. Or Koreans might go to China to look at the source of pollution in Seoul that originates in the industries of Northeast China and consider what might be done. Much of NGO advocacy is directed at excesses of the private sector or of lack of transparency in government. An international organization, NGO, called Transparency International, established less than a decade ago, now publishes an annual list of all the countries of the world in rank order of how corrupt they are perceived to be, and another list of the states thought to be doing most of the corruption or the corrupting. Their local affiliates in 87 countries now monitor corruption and work actively with governments, other NGOs, and the private sector. They work with everybody. As you will have already noted from what I said, the question of international economic policy is extremely heated. NGOs like Oxfam, ActionAid, and 50 Years is Enough have been in the forefront of international activism to bring about reform or even abolition of the IMF, World Bank, and WTO. Much of this advocacy relates to concern over inequality and injustice perpetrated by powerful interests. NGOs are at the forefront of human rights concern, and they played a key role in worldwide efforts to gain approval of the International Criminal Court over the determined opposition of the United States again. NGOs, particularly many affiliated with church groups, played a leading role in the Jubilee campaign that led states and the IMF and the World Bank to eliminate debt of the poorest countries. Whenever war happens, limiting its terrible effects, particularly on women and children, is important for NGOs. The historic international campaign to establish an international treaty banning landmines owed most of its success to NGO initiative. In addition to these high-profile examples, much NGO advocacy is undertaken at national levels in support of women's reproductive health, education of girls, human rights, and other issues. The second field of NGOs is service deliveries. Many NGOs work to deliver services. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to develop this, but I will have the paper at your service and ready on internet for you all. The third field for NGOs is membership. Many NGOs are membership organizations that provide advocacy and of service for their membership. The World Association of Girl Scouts and Girl Guides and the Boy Scouts should be examples known to Koreans. That's why I wanted to talk about it too. In Uganda, the Girl Scouts were one of the exceptional organizations that had a very large membership, large numbers of volunteers as well as staff, who worked at modest salary providing educational programs for girls. While most NGOs fall into one of these categories, advocacy, service delivery, and membership, some may work in two or even all three areas. In the United States, the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, has become one of the wealthiest and diverse NGOs in the world. For its members, it publishes and distributes a magazine with information on matters related to aging and membership function. It also negotiates arrangements for low-cost health insurance, travel and other activities bordering on a service function. As one of the largest lobbying organizations in the United States, it wields significant influence on legislation related to older people, and legislators ignore it at their peril and advocacy function. Now, I can go on and to talk about NGOs, but I will just focus here on the NGOs for the future. Just as states, multinationals, international and regional organizations, as well as individuals, are challenged in the 21st century, so too are NGOs. Here are just a few thoughts on what they will need to do. First, find ways to collaborate with others. This is a lesson progressive NGOs like Greenpeace and the Rainforest Alliance in the United States learned some time ago. The strong get strong by connecting and sharing. Master and exploit the internet. As Tom Friedman's Montana example illustrated, and as his best-selling book illustrates even more, the private sector is out front in terms of understanding and using technology to its advantage. Regional NGO or local NGO able to communicate intensely in a region should be able to bring an important value added to many of the tasks and problems they face. The challenges facing the Northeast Asia region are enormous. It is a sub-region that deserves great attention. If we want to make progress in NGOs, we have to fight for our beliefs, for our mission. NGOs in developing countries will need to fight to obtain registration, to avoid censorship and regulations. They may also have to fight the influence of what we call gongos, NGOs promoted and used by governments. We call them gongos because they go hand in hand with governments. Be ready for change, for surely it will come. The special relationship that NGOs have with the United Nations under Article 71 of the Charters provides for a consultative relationship via the Economic and Social Council and through international organizations. We, at the Conference of NGOs in Consultative Relationship with the United Nations, or Congo, which I had the privilege to lead a few years ago, we work closely with the ECOSOC, with the Council at the United Nations. And we facilitate the work of NGOs with the whole system of the United Nations. In local communities and in nations, NGO may work in support of or against policies of the UN has adopted, and they may gather information or commentary to present to the United Nations. In local UN offices, the chief UN representative has been encouraged to engage NGOs in shaping national plans and programs. NGOs may also be involved in their implementations. Well, again, because of the time, I just go to my last point, which is focusing on reinventing world order in the 21st century. Responsibility would be a proper watchwork for this new coming century, and it should apply to everyone. States, international organizations, private sector, civil society, and individuals, by all means. All need to be responsible for delivering a sustainable and just world to coming generations without imposing on them unachievable goals that result from the flagrant excesses or inaction by us in the present. When we look around us, we see that the issues we need in order to be responsible in the future lie in most of the same areas that the UN system has sought to address. Through organizations created for those purposes and around which, for a decade, the peoples of the world were able to address through the world conferences. The United Nations is the organization that preeminently embodies hope for the peoples of the world. It is the one that, by shaping global awareness, is best suited to help connect individuals, civil society, and nations in a manner that they will be responsible and rise to their better instincts. Despite the slings and arrows of those who pursue more narrow interests, it is the one organization that has the moral stature and the mandate to speak for all mankind, human mankind, and exercise our responsibility to future peoples and to our planet. It is intolerable that the United Nations be dominated as it's today by a single great power. Negotiations should be undertaken to significantly reduce the United States' influence in the United Nations. The United Nations must be made financially viable through other sources of income and not to rely on the huge, supposedly, contribution of the United States. The long proposed Tobin tax on international financial transaction or some other equivalent must be pursued. Either the United Nations itself should become responsible for international economic policy, or the IMF, World Bank, and WTO should be reformed in such a way that they are accountable to the United Nations and that their policies are in consonance with overall United Nations goal. The financial crisis of the 90s and the failure of 20 years of structural adjustment has demonstrated that the market is not magic. There should be ways to curb the excesses of market economy. Among them, the unrestricted flow of international capital that has been the source of so many recent international crises. Long-delayed UN management reform should be pressed, including revision of personnel policies, improved auditing and oversight, and greater authority to the Secretary General so that he may better manage the organization. The United Nations should have the capability of a central humanitarian response mechanism to respond to emergency on very short notice. Efforts should be made to keep the pressure on the WTO to insist that the long-established European and American cotton and sugar subsidies that discriminate against developing countries are in fact eliminated. Any other subsidies should also be eliminated so that long-delayed exports from these countries can begin. Similar NGO follow-up is needed to ensure that the full range of debt forgiveness to the poorest countries is carried out. They must be provided grants and such appropriate forms of loans that will provide opportunity for growth without accumulating a return of the egregious debt burdens they have had to bear for so many years. NGOs should monitor the United Nations Global Compact with the private sector. The Millennium Development Goals are very important. Reforms such as these may make it possible for the world to work with a renewed sense of urgency towards achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Principles of these are a 50% reduction in extreme poverty and hunger, universal primary education, reduction of child mortality by 2/3, maternal mortality by 3/4, environmental sustainability, reversing the spread of HIV/AIDS, malaria and other disease, and a global partnership between rich and poor towards these ends. NGOs should be active and aggressive supporters in these efforts. NGOs need the United Nations, and the United Nations needs NGO. That special relationship should be respected and cherished. And I think this is how the world would be or would continue to be reinvented for a better life, a better humanity, and a better being for men and women in our world. Thank you.